gotten a couple of questions about the assignments just through email. I figured I would check with you guys and see if you guys had any questions before we started. I think you guys were able to answer most of the questions that you guys asked last week, but I just want to double check.
Yeah, it was no problem for me. The only thing I couldn't do was adding images. I don't know why I had trouble with that, but I just left that undone. So I did everything, but I didn't add any images. So it was
Okay.
not one of the requirements. So
Yeah, it wasn't one of the requirements for this point.
yeah.
It will be for the next one, but
Mhm.
and we can talk about that at the point. Okay, awesome. So, all right, let me share my screen. Last class, we looked at tables, and we looked at some real basic, like how we make our basic tables and stuff like that. So we are going to look at some optional information in just a second. Go view this file in Chrome. Okay, so this is where we kind of ended last week. We've got our first row, which has this is our information for what time the class is. We have our first column, which is this is what day we normally would meet, and then here are when the other hours are going to be as far as when finals would be. Okay, so we're trying to make, I believe it's this table here. Give it a second to load. Okay, this table here, which works, but is a little bit of a challenge, I think was the nicest way of putting this. This is not real easy to go and find information. I think this is a lot easier, but we want to do some things to make it stand out, make it a little bit better. So we created some styles and things like that. Now we're going to look at how we're going to add some of these default or some of these optional tags. They're going to help us organize our information just a little bit better. Okay, and we'll talk about why we're doing this process as well. So if I come down here, the first thing we want to look at is what's known as our thead or our table header. And this is used to group information. It's usually one row, it may be more, but it's usually just one row of information. And this is going to be our header. The reason for this is a couple of fold, and it depends upon if we're using an external library. There's some JavaScript libraries that will do some stuff for us. There's some other things that can be done as well. But if we have a JavaScript library, or we've defined, or some browsers will also do this by default, the TH or table header will stay stationary, and it will give us a scroll bar to scroll up and down. But because the table header part is stationary, we see exactly, it makes it easier for us to line up our rows and our columns. So just as an example, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to duplicate our rows just a couple of times just to make it a little bit easier to see. Okay, so if I load this, you'll see that I've got more information here, but I'm going to come up here, and in my table, I'm going to define my height as being 100 pixels. Now, remember that we said in CSS that a lot of our CSS rules are optional, okay? So right now, I've got this, I've defined it, but it's ignoring me because it's not going to fit on the screen. If I make my screen smaller, it just wants me to scroll the whole page, okay? So I'm going to come over here and add my thead and a closing thead. Oops. And then if I use thead, I'm going to use tbody. And this is table by. This is where the bulk of my information is going to be. If I can spell it. Okay. So now I use the thead and the tbody. You're noticing still that it's way bigger than 100 pixels. You should be able to see that. So it's still not fully agreeing with me. If I were to use some of the CSS JavaScript libraries and things that work together, sometimes this will automatically force it and then put a scroll bar in here, which is a nice little feature. Another thing that you'll sometimes see in addition to that is if we do, I'm gonna scoot just a little bit ahead so you can see how it's handled. But there's a property that we can apply to the table called table layout fixed. And what this does is this makes our table a little bit more consistent with how it's going to work. So notice it's still not really letting us do what we want it to do. It's making a little bit of changes here and there, but nothing that we can really see. So remember, whenever you're dealing with CSS, unless you have a library which is forcing it in some cases, this may be optional. And that's a problem, but we can work around it, okay? So our thead, if we have a thead, a lot of times we're going to have a tbody like this. And those are table head and table body. And the table head is going to define what, a header that should be stationary. It said some of those libraries will help us with that. We can do some extra styling with our thead. So if you really want to stand out, and this is especially beneficial if I have multiple rows of data inside my thead. A suggestion I tell people not to do is to put like a table header, like a caption inside of our table. That's usually not a good idea. There's better ways and places to do that. We'll see in just a minute. We have some information in here. Now, one of the things that we can also do, and is a highly recommended, and this is more for screen readers and JavaScript libraries and reading information by search engines and other types of automated tools, is I have these table header cells, but instinctively I can look at these and say, I know that 8 a.m. deals with this column here. But if you notice, if I try to go like click and drag, it grabs everything. It's not instinctive to a computer, even though it's instinctive to you. And so what I can do is I can specify something called scope. And I can say it's for a column. And this lets the browser and any automated type of tool know that this table header cell goes with this column. And like I said, that's more for external sources or screen readers. So if someone who's visually impaired, they can know what time gets associated with that particular column. I want to do something similar on my table header cells that are for my row. And so I'll use the attribute scope equals row, like that. And I can just come in here, all these table headers things. If I go and save this and reload it, it's not going to affect anything. So if I come in here and I reload, okay, I can't highlight this column or anything like that. But like I said, with the use of some programmatic methodologies, like some JavaScript libraries that There's several libraries that are out there to help make working with tables a little bit easier. We can do this, okay? The last one is sometimes I'll have a tfoot, which is short for table footer. And my table footer is often used to, what would I want to show at the bottom or at the end of my table. So if I think about my table header, that's where I'm kind of listing all my columns. It's optional because sometimes I don't need to have columns listing. I really should. tfoot is going to say, hey, I want to be able to kind of collect my information. So if I was doing something like, let's say I had a list of money collected per day or items sold per day, and I want to get a summation of that, or a count of how many transactions occurred or something like that, all that stuff to store at a table, I might put that information in a tfoot. Now, the HTML itself can't calculate that. I have to do those calculations. So it's not going to calculate it. But if I want to display it, that's usually where I'm going to put it. Your tfooter will also sometimes display in a stationary format. So do keep that in mind as well. I want to just, so I can't remember. Yeah, I didn't think it did. Okay. Excuse me. Let's look at some other things we can do with styling. We've talked about our rows, and we talked about using like the nth child for styling our rows, and this is some examples we have in here. We talked about our border, and my border can be even bigger than this. I have a 1 pixel border here. I could go in and say 3 pixels to make it kind of stand out, give it a little bit bigger, make it a little bolder. In the old days, it used to be that tables looked like they tried to make like a little 3D effect on them. And so instead of saying solid, they would do something like outset. I think it was outset. Oh, it's black. That's probably why it's not liking it. Let me make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. I'll make this ridiculously big so you can see it. If you look at this, can you guys see how it looks like a kind of a faux 3D effect to make it look like it's standing out?
Yeah.
Okay. So you say on the screen you only need about 3 to 5 pixels. When it's transmitting over the internet like this in a screen share, sometimes you have to make it really big so it stands out. Not too many people are doing this anymore. You know, if you look at something like this, you see it's got a border, but it's really thin. Okay. So most people are doing solid, and they'll use like 2 pixels or something like that, and they might use a different color, so it has a slightly different effect, and not just all black and white. Other things you can do. There's another one. Let's make sure I'm not jumping ahead. Is dealing with these cell borders. Okay, so you notice how you get a little bit of spacing. There's something called border collapse. It's a special property inside of CSS, and when you do that, if you'll notice how it takes those borders and makes them just kind of really disappear. So the idea is not that it makes your information tighter and smaller and harder to read, but it's so that you don't have those duplicated borders with our cells. If you remember correctly, we had we applied a border like this without table collapse. it looked like this, and he had all this double lines, and it made it actually harder to read. If you added the table collapse, now you just have a single line. It becomes much, much easier to read. On the example, and this isn't an HTML table, this is they're generating something on a canvas, which is a different format entirely. But we just have a top and bottom. And so that's also quite easily doable. Instead of specifying border, and this applies border all 4 sides, I could say something like border dash top. If I reload this, notice that I have here a border along the top. Okay, it's on top of all my cells. If I wanted to make sure it stands out, I could say also border bottom, which doesn't have a huge difference. It's kind of shared as far as that goes, but it's another way of helping it to just be visible and be seen, for lack of a better term. Okay, so if you see things where you don't have the vertical columns, just remember you can say border and a top or bottom. You don't have to specify border flat out. And this makes it just a lot easier, excuse me, in my opinion, to read and see. I might make it just a little bit thicker, just so it helps to stand out a little bit. I did against the top, that way every cell is showing up here, but it's not showing here. But I can make other changes. So for example, I might say, just as an example, tbody table header, tbody tables data cell. And the reason why is if I look at my border here along my bottom, notice how it looks versus my border on the top. The border on the top, the table row, is overriding the table border itself. When I said I only care about those inside of tbody, and I reload, notice how I now see a more pronounced space here. I don't see the extra line. Now you will also notice that I lost some vertical space, that padding, and that might be an issue. I might have to go in and make an additional rule for that and an additional selector. That's kind of up to you. We can look at some of those. Okay. Or I talked about that. And I might want to come in here for and this is another perfect example of why I might want to use my thead, even if I don't. I want to define for my very first element something special. Because it's part of my thead, I can either put on a thead overall or a thead with my table row. But I might come in here and say something like, okay, background color is black. My foreground color is white. Oops. And notice how this now becomes a lot more visible, so it stands out. My headers, often I will do something like this. So being able to use my thead instead of having to try to specify like a special class for that row or something else, it becomes very beneficial. I could also use things like hover. So if I'm trying to, if I look at this gets even though it's a lot better, this can get a little bit confusing, especially if I have a lot of data I've got to work with. So I might want to specify what's known as a hover pseudoclass. Now we've already seen this, like for example, on our anchor tags, we want to hover over a link, we want to change. Well, I can do the same thing with my table row. And I might just come in here, and specify a background color of, excuse me, this is a light blue. Looks a little purplish to me. You notice it's a light color, so I can still read my dark text on it. It's not overpowering, but I can now very easily line up wherever I am to find my information. So I can look at my screen and go, okay, I see where I'm supposed to be, and I can read this really clearly. And so there's little things like that that I can do to help make things easier to read, process, and use. So that's an example with using the hover. You can't even go to a hover with a particular cell. That's usually not necessary, for lack of a better term. It's usually not necessary. I might do TD hover, and just to kind of show you what this looks like. You notice that it causes a little bit of movement. You got to be careful with that because it can cause some movement. So you might say, well, I don't want to use a border. I'll just change the color and I'll say, I'll make it red. Oops, I'm sorry, should be background color. I'll make it this, kind of reddish orangey color. So, I can get a little bit extra use out of this. But I do have to be careful, in all honesty, as to how important that is. Is it important? Can I use this? Yes. Is it what I'm really needing to do? Maybe. That's something you just have to kind of weigh against how useful something is. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. Okay. One of the other things that you can do is you can define your child width. So let's just take a quick look at that. So here we're doing, if you're a thead, your th, and you're the first child of a th, I want to define your width. And you're noticing that, is it working? Is it not? It's a little hard to see. Okay, so I want to notice what happened here. So if I have this is th of my thead. So table header cell of my thead, and this is nth child 1. If I reload this, nothing's really big and happening in here, and I can adjust things a little bit. If I go to the second, it's looking for the second child, and that winds up happening to be a th cell. So this gets nice and wide. See that? If I said TD, because our first child is blank, it's a TD cell, it's not a table header, it's blank. You notice that it does get wider. So I can make some adjustments even, and I have to really kind of think about how I'm doing this, and does it work. As a first child, it's not a TH, it's a TD, so I need to be very aware of that. How does that affect me? It just kind of depends on what I'm looking at. But I can do these types of things. The fixed width also becomes very helpful in forcing this width of the columns, because by default, tables only want to be as wide as they need to be, and they only want to take up as they're going to take up. By default, they want to take up as about the same amount of space column-wise, one to the other. If this isn't here, this takes up a little bit more space, but these try to be about the same size. So the browser's making lots of judgment calls in here by saying table layout fixed. If I take this out, you'll see it does a similar type thing, but the table layout fix really helps provide a little bit of consistency because a lot of these CSS rules are not really rules, they're suggestions to a table. And that's a kind of a big problem that we have to work with. So giving a layout of fixed, being able to specify some width to make things fit a little bit better, be able to put some hovers in, especially for table row, to make things easier to read, as well as zebra striping. These are all things I think that are really beneficial in helping make this an easier system to work with. And that's the whole key thing is this being made easier to work with? If it's not, then we shouldn't do it. So just kind of keep that type of stuff in mind. Okay. Any questions with the optional tags thead, tfoot, or tbody? Any questions with those?
No.
No.
Okay. How about with the styles and how those were applied, or is there something maybe you want to see or maybe see a little bit differently, or again, as far as the styles with the table?
No, I understood.
Okay. So it's pretty straightforward, but I know, like I said, because they're suggestions, the thing that frustrated me was and they're a lot better at taking suggestions now than they used to be. But I would go and I'd style it saying like, why aren't you, and a perfect example here is height. You know, why aren't you 100 pixels high? If I set max height, you'll notice that it still doesn't change it. And max height should be this is the maximum height that you can get, period. It doesn't do it? No. You can do margin, this is a fun one, margin auto, and then specify width, 50%. And you'll notice that what it does, margin auto centers it on my screen, and the width at 50% is it's saying I want it to be 50% as wide as it needs to be. And you can specify here, 70%. Okay, so now it doesn't, loop and do that weird type of stuff. But if I get smaller, notice how it resizes and has to reflow my text and stuff like that. So it does some weird stuff as far as how that goes. If I set, I'm trying to remember. This one I don't remember because I haven't done very often. Yeah. Yeah, I can't believe it. Even that doesn't work. It's like I don't think this works. I had to. There's a rule in HTML that you could call Overflow that says what happens if an element is too big for a size box that you defined. So I defined tbody to be 100 pixels tall, and then set the overflow to scroll. So try to make it scroll, and it still wouldn't do it. So, yeah, that's not a trivial thing to fix. So I usually say, you know what, let the height be what the height's going to be. So, all right. That's all I have for today. Next week, we're going to cover just a little bit of forms, what a form is, how do we collect information from them, stuff like that. And we'll talk a little bit about programming languages as far as they're using a web. We're not going to like delve into them, don't worry. So you don't have to like say, oh, I need to pick up, how to learn JavaScript in 24 hours so I can understand what he's going to talk about. Don't worry about that. We're going to talk a very high level of what they do and why we use them and stuff like that. Same thing with the forms. And then that's going to be our last week of instruction. The next week, I think Monday is technically a class day, because all of the finals actually start on the 5th. But we'll just do that for review. So if you have any questions, anything you want to talk about as far as the quiz is going to cover everything from the last quiz forward that we discussed. So, like I said, we'll start talking about forms on next week, and we'll talk about programming level languages at the real high level. Just kind of talk about what they do, how they work, that type of thing. So that's what we'll do for next week. Okay. You guys said you didn't have any questions as far as homework and stuff like that, so I will let you go. I will stay online if you do have some questions. And one last thing I do want to pull up. This is, and I will put this in the chat window for you. If you haven't had a chance to, there's chat window. There it goes. This is a link to the instructor course evaluations. So I wasn't sure if they were going to actually do them or not this term because of having moved everything online and the virus and how things are working out as far as that goes. But they are, so I did want to give that to you guys, especially since you guys have been coming to these classes. They'll probably put in the email. I don't know if you guys get outside emails from these or not as well, but I did want to give that to you all so you could reference that and use that going forward. So otherwise, like I said, I'll stay on as long as you guys are on. Be more than happy to answer any questions that you guys have about homework or projects or anything going forward. Otherwise, we're done for a day. Feel free to take this time to start using it to work on the project, which is due, I think, the week of finals, I think is what it is. So well, I'm trying to make sure you guys have plenty of time to work on that. As I know you got other classes and finals and exams and project stuff in those too. So, all right. So if that's everything, you all have a good and safe weekend. Do stay safe wherever you're at. And I will see you on Monday, if not before.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. Take care.
Bye.